Hi everyone, welcome back. My name's Johan. I'm proud to be chair of this session this afternoon. And I'll start with a brief story, as everyone has started, about how I met Joe and how our journey started. I think a bit like many others, my encounter with Joe came before I actually met him. So I was a medical student in New Zealand when I picked up an introduction to political philosophy. And I realized that actually medicine perhaps was not the calling I had in life. I realized I was more interested in the philosophical questions, who should get what and why, as Joe pointedly asked. And so from there, I picked up an additional degree in philosophy, still finished that degree, and then came here on a Rhodes Scholarship for my master's and PhD. And the first time I met Joe was also over pints, down the road, I believe, during COVID, because Dan Butt had gone on sabbatical. So I don't know if I should say thank you. But no. And I was just saying to others that I think the breadth of scholars and people here is a testament to Joe's wide-ranging work and influence. So yeah, very, very pleased to be here and exceptionally happy to be able to celebrate Joe's career at this event. This session, I've got the pleasure of introducing two speakers. So Sadie Regmi and Tom Shakespeare. So Sadie is a DPhil researcher at the Ethox Centre here at the University of Oxford. She's a physician working in public health, bioethics, and political philosophy. And in her doctoral research, she examines when and if restrictions on basic liberties to secure population health justice are justified. Professor Tom Shakespeare is Professor of Disability Research at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Tom is the author of Disability Rights and Wrongs and enjoys learning from philosophers, psychologists, and epidemiologists, and especially enjoys pointing out when they are wrong. So let me hand the floor to Sadie. Please let us welcome her.
Thank you, Johan. And I actually didn't prepare anything about how I met Joe, but I was also a medical student, a first-year medical student, and started working in bioethics. And I was interested in I was interested in public health and some wider questions. And I think you were organising some kind of ethics of nudging event at UCL with Cass Sunstream's book was kind of out around that. Anyway, so I went along, but then a couple of years later, you released this podcast on Philosophy Bites on political bioethics and sort of describing some of these questions about distribution of resources in health, which I found really interesting. And I guess like Johan, I also went on to study philosophy, which when I was doing in the US, just before the pandemic, Joe happened to come and give a talk. And I, mentioned that I'd been interested in his work, and I was able to then come and start a PhD, which he's supervising. So yeah, thank you. And I know we're not the only ones. I know that lots of people have done the masters that you started at UCL and have been kind of working on health and philosophy. So let me start by. So this is my talk. So I'm just going to take us back to the COVID-19 pandemic. I know sometimes people don't really want to do that, but so governments around the world took drastic measures to limit viral spread. Hospital and care home visitation rules meant many people died or gave birth alone. Border controls meant many individuals weren't free to see close friends, lovers, and families for many months, sometimes for years. These policies seem to violate basic liberties we normally take for granted. But given that healthcare providers and governments were dealing with a pandemic and loss of lives on a huge scale, were policies such as these justified? So today I want to present a novel defense of extraordinary measures in emergency situations like a pandemic. I'll argue that the state is justified in imposing measures that involve deprioritizing basic liberties to avoid a situation of extreme scarcity. So this is because extreme scarcity threatens to bring societies outside the circumstances of justice. But crucially, the measures must be proportionate and necessary to secure the circumstances of justice itself. So I'll start by presenting Joe's 3 waves of pandemic ethics as a lens through which to understand the ethical response to the pandemic. And I'll focus on his claim that the early pandemic response seems to have been strongly consequentialist. I'll then attempt to provide a justification for such policies that's compatible with and constrained by a liberal egalitarian framework. So I'll defend 3 claims today. So the first is that liberal theories of justice operated within the so-called circumstances of justice, notably conditions of moderate scarcity and confined generosity. And emergencies like pandemics, this is the wrong slide. Natural disasters threaten the circumstance of justice. As the risk of tipping out of the circumstance of justice increases, the priority of the basic liberties may be relaxed insofar as this is done in a morally permissible way. And by that I mean it's proportionate and necessary to secure the circumstances of justice itself. So whether policies are justified or not depends on certain empirical facts as they're known at the time of decision. So the obvious ones in the case of a pandemic are how easily transmissible the pathogen is, how harmful it is, how harmful the interventions to limit pathogen spread are vaccines and treatments available, how harmful are potential worst-case scenarios and how probable are they. But there are also many ethical questions about the role and limits of state intervention that ought to shape decisions, such as whether people's fundamental liberties can be curtailed to save others. So importantly, these ethical considerations are sensitive to empirical facts and will have different implications as the situation evolves. So a helpful way of thinking about this, which Joe has highlighted in a short article in Philosopher's magazine from 2022, is that the moral response to the pandemic consists of several phases. So the emergency response, the crisis phase, and the moral legacy. So with regard to the emergency period, Joe notes that it required extremely quick decision-making with no time for formal consultation or any other kind of processes, forcing leaders to act boldly in conditions of major uncertainty. And Joe notes in this phase, and I quote, "The overwhelming moral reaction seems to have been one of what we can call negative consequentialism. What do we need to put in place to minimize the most serious harms and to give us the breathing space to put in place more considered measures?" End of quote. So next we have the crisis management phase. And in this period, Joe notes that authorities were working out how to balance restrictions on freedom with protecting public health. And Joe notes that policies still had a strong consequentialist element and were aimed at giving most people as normal a life as possible, despite health threats and movement restrictions. So these majority-focused policies inevitably left out people in unusual roles or unconventional categories. And finally, we have the moral legacy phase, which according to Joe extends indefinitely into the future. The focus in this phase, according to Joe, ought to be on repairing the damage that was done, and we might think that, Joe at least argues that we should pay attention to groups that are most vulnerable and most likely to have suffered harm. So in the article, Joe focuses the most attention on moral legacy. What can we do now that the emergency and crisis phases of the pandemic are behind us? And that's understandable given this is the phase requiring immediate attention. But I want to focus instead on what Joe has described as the emergency and crisis management phases. So this isn't just to ruminate, but I do think that an ethical assessment of early phases of an emergency can help us to prepare for the next pandemic, or more generally, the next emergency. And perhaps it can even help us to shed light on what we owe each other going forward. So for simplicity, I'll refer to the emergency phase and the crisis phase jointly as the emergency response. So it's just because both phases require extraordinary measures, and they're seemingly consequentialist. The measures are seemingly consequentialist in nature. So I interpret Joe's claims about the consequentialists in the emergency response to be predominantly descriptive. But Joe also seems to suggest that policies with a strong consequentialist element may be justified in the emergency response, owing to the need for decisive and quick action. Now, Joe's not explicit on what he means by consequentialism in this short piece, But when I refer to consequentialism in emergency response, I have in mind two key features. So the priority of beneficence over what we normally consider absolute rights, and an aggregative approach. So the priority of beneficence entails that the primary goal is to save lives and protect health at the expense of other considerations such as protecting people's basic liberties. Aggregation entails that the primary goal is to promote welfare of the many at the expense of minorities and more difficult and complex cases. The concern with overall welfare can be contrasted with a special concern for the worst off. So perhaps the clearest defense of the primacy of consequentialism, or more specifically utilitarianism, as the correct normative framework for assessing policy in pandemics is given by Julian Savulescu, Ingmar Persson, and Dominic Wilkinson in a paper in Bioethics from 2020. So they note, and I'm quoting here, but there are no egalitarians in a pandemic. The scale of the challenge for health systems and public policy means that there's an ineluctable need to prioritize the needs of the many. It is impossible to treat all citizens equally, and a failure to carefully consider the consequences of actions could lead to massive preventable loss of life. In a pandemic, there's a strong ethical need to consider how to do the most good overall. So, there are possible, so that's kind of one approach, they're defending utilitarianism as a framework. But I want to highlight that while there are kind of clearly consequentialist features of a plausible pandemic response, endorsing this doesn't commit us to the view that consequentialism is the right moral theory, simpliciter, or the right moral theory for emergencies. So first, there are kind of consequentialist elements in any plausible moral theory, and secondly, there are other plausible justifications for these consequentialist features. So some philosophers have suggested ways in which we can reconcile the deprioritization of basic liberties in times of crisis in ways I think are compatible with a liberal egalitarian framework. So, for example, Kieran Oberman has argued that while measures like lockdowns restrict freedom, they also restrict the restrictions, limit the restrictions on freedoms that people going around with viruses kind of impose on us. And if lockdowns make it safer for individuals to move around when they do go out, then they preserve certain freedoms that would otherwise be restricted. So this idea can be seen to be in line with a liberal egalitarian framework where basic liberties may be traded for the sake of securing other, perhaps more important liberties, but not for general welfare gains. Clark Wolf has taken a different approach when writing about the potential consequences of a climate emergency. So he proposes the incorporation of a basic needs principle as a first principle of justice prior to even protecting basic liberties. I want to suggest a different approach. So I think this approach is also in line with the liberal egalitarian framework. And I want to suggest that at least some extraordinary measures in emergencies may be justified when emergencies threaten the circumstances of justice itself. As the risk of tipping out of the circumstances of justice increases, the priority of the basic liberties may be relaxed, insofar as this is proportionate and necessary to secure the circumstances of justice itself. So while some of the actions in an emergency can be construed as consequentialist, this is best explained as a way of safeguarding the circumstance of justice, not that consequentialism somehow becomes a right standard in emergencies. So is that... Sorry, it's not very clear, but theories of justice are often thought to operate within so-called circumstances of justice, so most notably conditions of moderate scarcity and confined generosity. If these circumstances aren't met, justice doesn't apply. So the contemporary articulation of this view comes from John Rawls. About the circumstances of justice, he writes, and I quote, "Natural and other resources are not so abundant that schemes of cooperation are superfluous, nor are conditions so harsh that fruitful ventures must inevitably break down." So Rawls takes this idea from David Hume. In the treatise, Hume notes, "It's only from the selfishness and confined generosity of men, along with the scanty provision nature has made for his wants, that justice derives its origin." Hume's broader point is that if we were in a state of abundance, where there was more than enough to go around, justice would be totally useless. In the inquiry, he writes, "Why call this object mine, when upon the seizing of it by another, I need but stretch out my hand to possess myself to what is equally valuable?" To the extent that justice is understood as the rightful distribution of entitlements, property, and resources more generally, in a state of plenty, Hume argues, justice would have no role. It would be irrelevant. And the same is true, Hume argues, of the opposite extreme. So in a state of extreme scarcity, justice would be impossible. Is it any crime after a shipwreck to seize whatever means or instrument of safety one can lay hold of, without regard to the former limitations of property? Or if a city besieged were perishing with hunger, can we imagine that men will see any means of preservation before them and lose their lives from a scrupulous regard to what, in other situations, would be the rules of equity and justice? Between these situations of abundance and extreme scarcity, we have moderate scarcity and limited generosity, where justice is supposed to apply. Rawles's account of circumstances of justice diverges from Hume's in several respects, but I won't go into that here today. What they agree on is the claim that there is a lower and upper bound to justice. So my concern is with the lower bound of the circumstances of justice, the transition from moderate to extreme scarcity. So scarcity refers to a shortage of resources. So to be in a situation of moderate scarcity requires that people have enough. However, as Robert Goodin argues, whether people have enough can't refer to circumstances of individual people or the average across the population. If a minority live in abundance and the rest live in extreme scarcity, surely justice would apply. Goodin suggests that moderate scarcity must refer to the distributive possibilities associated with any given stock of resources. So with respect to the lower bound, he argues that the circumstances of justice obtain if and only if it's possible to distribute a stock of resources in such a way that everyone's basic needs are met. So for Goodin, if no possible distribution of resources could result in everyone's basic needs being satisfied, we're in a situation of extreme scarcity where circumstances of justice don't apply. Intuitively, on Goodin's view, my second claim is very likely to hold. So emergencies like pandemics and natural disasters can threaten the circumstances of justice. Emergencies typically create a situation of scarcity where it becomes difficult to meet everyone's basic needs. These situations are characterized by the risk of tipping from moderate to extreme scarcity. But you might object that Goodin sets the lower bound too high. We can imagine a situation where there are 5 shipwrecked survivors at sea, but there's only enough food for 2 of them until help can reach them. So even in such extreme cases, we can imagine just and unjust ways of deciding who'll survive. Someone who decides to kill their fellow passengers while they sleep and eats their flesh seems to be acting unjustly, whereas drawing lots to decide who should throw themselves into the sea might seem more just. This example seems to show there are rules of justice that apply even in situations where everyone's basic needs can't be met. Matthew Adams and Ross Mittiger, in a 2020 paper, argued that as long as an allocation of resources can significantly improve the situation of even one person, the circumstances of justice obtain. But crucially, they argue the content of justice changes with increased scarcity. And as that scarcity increases, egalitarian considerations should gradually be relaxed or suspended in favor of consequentialist considerations. So there are 2 possible responses to their objection. One is to distinguish duties of justice from other duties and moral reasons that guide our behavior in extreme situations. So consider this true story told by the American author Annie Dillard. I quote, "When Scots Captain Oates sacrificed himself on the Antarctic Peninsula because his ruined feet were slowing the march, he stepped outside the tent one night to freeze himself in the blizzard, saying to the others, 'I'm just going outside and maybe some time.'" End of quote. How should we understand Oates' sacrifice? Adams and Mittiger might say that it was required by a duty of justice, more specifically the consequentialist norm that applies in cases of extremity. But I think a more plausible assessment of Oates' act is to see it as a form of moral sainthood, an act of supererogation, an act worthy of praise for its display of extraordinary moral character. And in one sense, it's correct to say that he ought to have done what he did. But to say that he was bound by justice to do it seems like an implausibly high standard. If this is right, we might grant a high bar for the lower bound of justice, circumstance of justice, if not Goodin's high bar. while still claiming that there are better or worse ways of acting in situations that fall outside the circumstance of justice. A second response is to point out the role of scarcity of moral motivation in ensuring the circumstance of justice obtain, which seems to be missing from Adams and Mittiger's account. So for both Hume and Rawls, whether the circumstances of justice obtain is a matter both of moral motivation and material resources. We shouldn't take people to be moral saints or pure egoists. So crucial for our purposes is that when a disaster leads to a breakdown of normality, trust and goodwill may also break down. When there is uncertainty about whether people are unsafe in the face of others or will receive their fair share, Hobbesian traps might undermine order and become a self-fulfilling prophecy, leading to even greater material scarcity. Let's make this more concrete by examining the early phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the pandemic was characterized by an exponential increase in the virus that threatened to overwhelm hospitals, making it impossible in many places to provide basic health care to a large part of the population. Without restrictive measures to prevent the spread of the virus, many people would die. And there was real risk of institutional collapse, of hospitals kind of collapsing. So in the absence of measures to prevent the spread of the virus, people would, in a very real sense, be turned against each other. When everyone is a possible bearer of the virus, we can't trust each other or trust that cooperative ventures will be in our collective benefit. Rather, everyone is a potential aggressor to ourselves and our loved ones. Uncertainties relating to whether markets are able to produce enough for everyone can contribute to failures of coordination. People who would otherwise be disposed to care about their fellow citizens might be afraid that others will hoard resources, which can lead people to preemptively hoard in response. Through such Hobbesian traps, a key cooperative venture, the sharing of resources through a decentralized market process, can break down. Whether we accept Goodin's characterization of the circumstances of justice obtain, it seems like the early phase of the pandemic, where there's a lot of uncertainty about the case-fatality ratio or the virulence of a pathogen, or uncertainty about how our fellow citizens will respond, was qualified as a situation that could lead to a breakdown of order and the inability of many to protect their basic needs. So turning finally to my final claim, as the risk of tipping out of the circumstances of justice increases, the priority of the basic liberties may be relaxed insofar as it is proportionally necessary to secure the circumstances of justice itself. So one reason for endorsing this claim is to think that it is likely that it would be agreed upon by the representative agent behind the veil of ignorance. So if the situation turns into chaos, when justice no longer applies, society as a cooperative venture is threatened, then nothing is secure. Although people want to give priority to the basic liberties in ordinary situations, they would want justice to be secured instead of insisting on the priority of liberty in extreme circumstances. The view is also theoretically attractive because it provides a consistent justification for the deprioritization of basic liberties in the early phases of the pandemic, which otherwise might be hard to explain. The view allows temporary deprioritization of the basic liberties to secure the circumstance of justice. Since the circumstances of justice are required for justice, this provides a non-arbitrary justification from deviating from liberalism in emergency like a pandemic. But crucially, I think the view also provides an appealing account of the moral limits on curtailing liberties in an emergency response. So consider John Rawls' discussion of historical contingencies, in particular his discussion of when social conditions do not allow the effective establishment of rights required by the principles of justice. Rawls seems to be referring to less economically wealthy societies. He states that in such cases one can concede the limitation of rights, where this is necessary to prepare the way for a free society by raising the level of civilization. Here I take Rawls to be saying that where there is material scarcity, we may depart from the ideal principles of justice, in particular the lexical priority of the basic liberties, when in the long run this would result in circumstances where ideal principles may be realized. However, this doesn't mean that we can use any means possible to secure the circumstance of justice. So for Rawls, policies and courses of action taken must be morally permissible, politically possible, and likely to be effective in moving society toward the ideal of perfect justice. The similar constraints would apply in the case of emergencies. And although I don't have time to go into here, I think the most plausible way of understanding these constraints is in terms of necessity and proportionality as it is understood in the contemporary just war literature. So to conclude, I just want to stress that the view I've defended is consequentialist in the narrow sense. It allows infringements of liberties to avoid more infringement of liberties that would occur if the pandemic caused extreme scarcity and a breakdown of justice. But as such, I think it could be in line, potentially, with Joe's observation that emergency responses involve strong consequentialist elements aimed at creating breathing space for more considered measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadie. We'll now welcome Professor Tom Shakespeare.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be here and to help celebrate the great work of Joe Wolfe. And I think he's very helpful because he says that a philosopher, an academic, but particularly a philosopher, has a role in public debates, that he can... so I like that. I like the fact that we're relevant suddenly, which is great for all academics in the room. And also for all non-philosophers in the room, that he doesn't use technical language all the time. So people like us can understand it. And more to the point, as a social scientist, he and Avnet use evidence, which is great. They actually talk to other people, not just philosophers, which obviously as a social scientist I love. But this book, I think, is very good in terms of, well, it's very good for many reasons. But for me, who's a disability researcher, it's good because it talks about clustering, which is a very helpful concept. It talks about corrosive disadvantage and fertile functionings. And it talks about what policy interventions may be successful for people. So I think that's really good. Often in the disability world, we're very good at talking about the way we're ground down by oppression. We're very good at talking about the way that society is not built for our interests. But there is a danger of replacing, if you like, biological determinism with social determinism. In other words, we're still blooming victims. We're not victims of our body, we're victims of a terrible world. So it's great that Joe and Avnet help us to see how you can have a policy which does something about the terrible world, dismantles the terrible world, makes people less likely to be victims of it. So I think that's really, really good. And that focus on agency and that focus on policy is really good. But I want to say there's another problem, because obviously I want to say that you didn't say everything, or at least you probably think it, but you just certainly didn't say it or write it. And I think there is a problem if we attribute all the disadvantage experienced by disabled people to oppressive social factors. So we can talk about discrimination, we can talk about oppression, we can talk about ableism, we could talk about the way that society is made and built and created to make it difficult to have an impairment. Therefore, it is a discriminatory society. And you do find this in materialist accounts, people like Michael Oliver and Colin Barnes. They're all about how disability really is the relationship, there is oppression, is the relationship with a discriminatory society. But it's also found in constructionist accounts, critical disability studies, people who I'm sure you read approvingly. I think, that's fair enough. But very helpfully, I haven't got Nussbaum to hand, but I have got you and Avnet to hand. So Martha Nussbaum, who I do agree with, I do agree with your general critical, the approach of Sen and Nussbaum, I do like that, the capability approach. But she talks about, you made a list, her list here, life, the normal length of life. How many disabled people get a normal length of life? Most don't. Many don't. Bodily health. How many disabled people get that bodily health? Most often don't. Bodily integrity, even sense, imagination, thought, they're not available to lots and lots of disabled folk. Even number 5, emotions. Many disabled people do not experience emotions in the same way as the majority. Practical reason, affiliation, and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is that the reason that people are excluded from these very important goals, important value goods, is partly to do with the ways society is created, but also partly to do with the nature of disability. And I want to say that disability is not the same as gender or race or sexuality or class. I don't think it is, because I think most of those forms of life do not involve inherent disadvantage. And I think for many disabled people, there is an inherent disadvantage. And so I want philosophers to think, I know philosophers traditionally have thought about it, but I want people to think about it in ways which are not discriminatory and to say, how do we deal with this? And not all the philosophers do. I think there's a paradox. I want to say that impairment is bad. It is bad. It's bad to have it. It's bad to gain it. We look both ways when we cross the road. We don't want to, if we're disabled already, we don't want another impairment. That would, or a higher impairment. I've got a L2 paraplegia. I don't want to have C2, obviously. Because I would have to have it would make life more difficult if I did. So I think impairment is bad. Yet, and here I think I'm not a philosopher, but I think this might be a paradox. If impairment is bad, life with impairment must also be bad. Wrong. It's not bad. And it's not bad, and we can see it's not bad. So many people who have impairments lead very good lives. There's actually a book called, an article called The Disability Paradox by Gary Elbrecht and Patrick de Vlieger, who I'm sure you've seen. There's Ron Amundsen's work, there's lots of our work, there's empirical work, left, right, and centre, that disabled people do lead good lives and can lead good lives. So surely if impairment is bad, and if disabled people live good lives, yeah, I'm not a philosopher, but I think that's a paradox, isn't it? And how do we resolve that? And I want to give you an option for resolving it, which you might think is rubbish. And I want to say that life with an impairment can be good if, and mostly if, I'm not going to say only because that's a hostage fortune, but mostly if your choices are met. You can realise your choices. So, for example, I knew there'd be an accessible toilet here. I knew I wouldn't have to go downstairs to the toilet and stumble and crash and it'd be embarrassing and painful. I knew this is a public building in the University of Oxford, it's going to have an accessible toilet. Great. I knew I'd be able to get on the bus this morning. Maybe not the first bus. I had to get on the bus at 7 o'clock, not because I was so keen to come to Oxford, because during rush hour you can't get on the bus if you have a wheelchair because you take up 5 people's spaces. And the bus driver looks at you and goes, "Oh, sorry, mate. No, you're not coming on until 9 o'clock." So you have to go on at 7 o'clock. So you can get on the bus. I have a right to get on the bus, but practically I can get on the bus when this. So if I have my needs met, if I come by an accessible means, if I live in an accessible house, if I have my own house, has got a loo I can use and a bed I can sleep in and all the rest of it. So I want to say that disabled people can have a good quality of life if their choices are met. So Vic Finkelstein, who's one of the sort of pioneers of disability studies, talked about the village, the parable of the village. And this is a village adapted for disabled people who use wheelchairs and non-disabled people really disadvantaged by it. They kept on bashing their head because it's all low and everyone said, "Oh, it's just silly, you being tall. It's all your fault." Well, of course, it was a parable. It was a joke in a way. It was funny. But there's a solution, which is, of course, the non-disabled people could have got into wheelchairs. They would not have banged their head. They could have been just the same as all the disabled people. Maybe they wouldn't be quite as confident in their wheelchairs, but they would have been okay in their wheelchairs. They could have managed the circumstances. And Janet Radcliffe Richards, we argued about disability, and she said the important thing about disability is it's not reversible. You cannot make an ability into a disability. So maybe you can, but let's assume that generally that's the case. So the village is fine. as long as people have wheelchairs, people can get access to wheelchairs. We know only 15% of people in the world have access to assisted devices that they need. Many people crawl around on the floor. This wheelchair costs £3,000, so because it's made for me and it's rubbish, but I've got alkies. But it's not available to most people in Britain, let alone in the rest of the world. But if our choices are met, if we have an accessible home, if we have an accessible loo, if we have an accessible wheelchair, if we have a venue like this which invites us and wants to hear what we have to say, then we are equal. We are all equal. But, and this is where it relates to the former wonderful presentation, is that often those conditions do not pertain. They do not pertain in climate crisis, and they don't, they don't pertain in a pandemic situation. They're not in emergencies, because if you are a refugee, if you are in as we've heard, if you're in a situation of a pandemic, not only are your ethics different maybe, but also what you can rely on are different. So if anybody's been to a informal settlement or a refugee camp, they know that all my preconceptions about loos and about basic living do not apply. Because they're narrow roadways, probably too narrow even for my wheelchair. They get very muddy. There's a long queue at the latrine. The latrines are not suitable, appropriate for me, and so forth. So many of us are spending a lot of our time trying to make sure that in informal settlements and in pandemics, for that matter, disabled people are not forgotten and not left behind. So emergency preparedness, make sure that whatever you get, whatever pertains in those situations, is available, is possible for all. And there's lots of attention on all the ways in which, at the moment or recently, it's not been possible for all. So that is my solution. And in a way, it relates back to what Joe and Avner have said. It's about secure functioning. Functioning is very important, but that is really helpful that you've added. How secure are they? Can we rely on them? Can we rely on them in a different situation? Can I rely on them if I become more impaired? That would be another condition. At the moment, everything is fine. At the moment, your home is fine. But when I was in rehab in 2008, I was able to go home because I lived in an accessible home. The other two people I was with did not and could not. They could not go home because they were now wheelchair users, and their loo and their bedroom and everything else was upstairs. So they had to move. Their partners or their families had to move in order for them to be made available. So in a way, I kind of want to say disability is a disadvantage. It's a physical disadvantage, not just a social disadvantage. You might be expecting me to go on about all the ways in which we're socially disadvantaged. That would be predictable and right, and we could have had an interesting time there. But I want to deal with a more difficult thing, and I think philosophy should deal with a more difficult thing. It should deal not just with people who are, as it were, able to be included in the liberal consensus about society and about justice, but people at the margins, people who cannot be included. And it's very relevant in this regard that John Rawls does not talk about disability in the theory of justice. He kind of says, oh, look, I can't talk about that, I'll talk about this. And I'm not saying anything negative about theory of justice, but I want in future our settlements, our understandings, our theories to embrace all of the diversity of humankind. Because if we don't, they're fine, but they're only for a limited number of people, and we need to be for everybody. So,
thank you very much. We'll take questions, and you can feel free to keep your hand up, and I'll write them down. Yeah, and if you could please also introduce your name and just a quick one-line statement on what you do. Alice, feel free to go ahead.
Thanks very much. Hi, I'm Alice from the University of Reading.
Wait for the microphone. Is there a microphone coming?
Sorry, yes, please do wait for the microphone.
Well, people online won't hear you.
Hi, I'm Alice from the University of Reading. Thank you for the interesting talks. I had a question for Sadie, and I was wondering how much it matters for your argument that when we're talking about COVID, we're talking about an emergency unfolding over these reasonably contained kind of time frame. Because as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking a bit about the climate emergency and thinking that we're similarly we're risking tipping and actually tipping out of the circumstances of justice, and particularly from moderate scarcity to conditions of more extreme scarcity. And so I wondered what you thought about that and whether you kind of see parallels between the structure of your argument and certain kinds of arguments for climate authoritarianism, and what you think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks for that. So, couple of things on that. So, I think some people have kind of argued that, so exactly what you're saying, that climate emergency would be an example. And I think that's right, that we could, that risk could be there. I suppose what I would say about the authoritarianism point is that, sorry, I don't know why there's feedback. Should I? Yeah. Is that I said that there are kind of constraints, and so while it gives us a general direction, the overall goal is still towards kind of justice and to kind of securing the circumstances. So I think while it would definitely justify kind of measures to make sure we don't go into and we don't put people in a situation where they tip into scarcity, so there's a huge imperative to do that. I don't think it would necessarily justify, linked to authoritarianism, because then we would be going further away potentially from justice. Thanks.
Paul Billingham.
Thanks, Johnny. I'm Paul Billingham, and I'm based here in Oxford. So sorry, this is also for Sadie. So this might just be clarificatory, but so the claim was that if there's a risk of tipping outside the circumstances of justice, then the state can set aside basic liberties. So the claim there seems to involve the idea that we have reasons to prevent going outside the circumstances of justice. And I guess as a general claim, that doesn't seem to me like it can be right. So imagine that we were going to go outside the circumstances of justice in the other direction. So there was a great risk of huge abundance, or a great risk that everyone was going to become super benevolent. I take it we wouldn't think, quick, stop basic liberties. So that general claim can't seem to be right. So then I'm not quite sure I understand the argument. So I agree we have good reason to prevent extreme scarcity, but I don't think the reason can be we must stay within the circumstances of justice and we have reason to prevent going outside it. Because as a general claim, that just faces these counterexamples on the other side.
Thank you. That's interesting. So I should have definitely made it about kind of extreme scarcity. So Gooden has a way of, so he's got two desiderata in a way for how he thinks about this. And essentially it's like we should try to make the lower bound as low as possible. So essentially, that justice should apply in as wide a range of circumstances. But when it comes to the upper bound, we also should try to increase that. So it doesn't kind of go in just, it doesn't go in the same direction. So I think that's right. Does that sort of... So if we were to increase the, abundance is potentially great, although I think it has actually received a bit more sort of attention. So David Estlund and others kind of arguing that, justice would apply even in case of abundance because of ethical disagreement. But when it comes to scarcity, I do think we have reasons to avoid scarcity. So yeah, you're right. I should modify that to make it clear that it's about scarcity, not about circumstance of justice itself. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Sure. Dominic.
Apologies, I have another question directed at Sadie, but Tom might wish to also respond. So, Sadie, I think your basic argument sounds plausible, but one concern might be that the risk of a society tipping outside the circumstances of justice becoming extremely scarce depend in part on their prior investment in basic services, and also the degree of prior inequality, because one of the things about pandemic is that it's worst for those who are already disadvantaged, and they will be deprived the circumstances of justice even more. So if you have a society that, for example, doesn't invest in its health system, so it has no capacity to flex when it has a winter pandemic, it looks like it's justified now in imposing, for example, mandatory vaccination against influenza in the winter, because otherwise the health system's going to fall over. Or what about a society that actually, even in basic circumstances, is extremely both unequal or doesn't care for those with disability or doesn't have the circumstances of justice? It looks like they're entitled to be authoritarian as a baseline. So how are you going to respond to that? And I don't know whether Tom wants to talk about the challenge in existing societies that aren't doing what they need to be doing.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So the first kind of part of your thing about what I take to be like preparedness, I think that's actually where I wanted to go, so I haven't had a chance to explore it yet, but it does seem like if we have reasons to avoid being in circumstance justice, we do have reasons to, to prepare, so we're not in a situation where we kind of risk kind of tipping it. In the context of climate emergency, Lucas Stanchik has made an argument that's kind of, I think, is sort of similar, that we have a duty not to kind of put others in a situation, future generations in a situation where they have to make these really difficult choices. So I think that's right. I think that I haven't had a chance to develop it yet or think about it yet, but I think there is an implication for preparedness, which I think is really important. There's the second part of your question about kind of distributive inequalities in current societies. So I think that's where, I want to go back to kind of Goodin's characterization. So he says that there must be the possibility of everyone having their basic needs met. So not kind of actually everyone having their basic needs met, but the possibility must exist. And also, I guess, kind of goodwill and generosity. So I think, and I take it that kind of justice requires these things in kind of normal situations. So I think, I don't know if that sort of answers, but in the second case, we do have an imperative in normal times to be sort of securing basic liberties for everyone, and also trying to kind of make sure that there is equality, both so that we don't, both for kind of independent reasons, but also so that we don't kind of find ourselves in these situations where we kind of risk, we become so vulnerable that in emergencies we kind of risk tipping outside the circumstances. If we're robust, then that is presumably much less likely to happen.
I think that's right. If we're prepared, if we have, for example, supplies of insulin or whatever stockpiled, we have emergency preparedness, we have a more equal health system, we have an accessible health system, it will be better. But that being said, there's also a sense in which an emergency or a pandemic is more difficult for some people than others. For example, in this room, I'm sure many people just wrote more papers in the pandemic, because it was great, because all they do is sit at home and write papers. I know I did. But if your social life is ring up your mates if you have any, that's great. You can do that in a pandemic. But if your social life is constructed by voluntary sector, by going to a project, and that is now closed because you cannot meet together in that project. That project is closed down for 2 years. Your social life has been taken away for 2 years. We did research with disabled people after the pandemic, during the pandemic, and somebody said, you can only watch so much television, because that's all they did. They slept or they watched television. They didn't have resources, which they didn't write papers. They didn't have resources. So I'm saying there's a differential impact of a pandemic, but also that, of course, we need to prepare and make sure everybody's needs are met.
Can I just jump in here with an online question that's actually similar to what you just said, Tom? It's from Samantha Livy in the Department for Continuing Education. So she asks, for disabled people ordinarily in their homes, the response to the pandemic offered freedoms and inclusion ordinarily denied to them. For example, they were able to access educational courses, book and film festivals, working practices, meetings were all default online. There was a belief that things would never go back the way they were. Could you please comment on how we can better learn from the pandemic to improve and maintain access and inclusion for disabled people?
Well, it's really annoying. The pandemic was obviously terrible, but it's also really annoying because disabled people were saying we should have online access. They were saying for years, and non-disabled people who run these things were saying, oh no, that's far too complicated. Then the pandemic comes, and suddenly everything is online. So disabled people are saying, blimey heck, yeah, we've been asking for this for years. So that is a value. Second thing is that occurs to me is that people with dementia were organising with Zoom and knew how to use Zoom long in advance of us, everybody else. So people with dementia who have been organising through Dementia Voice and so forth were educating people without dementia in how to use Zoom and how to run meetings and how to gather with your colleagues online, which we did not have. So that's also interesting. And thirdly, a guy who's basically housebound said to me, you know, in this situation, everybody is experiencing what I ordinarily experience. So I'm well adapted to it because I had 20 years of being housebound or whatever it might be. And these people, you know, they're bleating after a week of it. So I do find it quite interesting. I hope that I'm glad that you have online access. What was a shame was so many institutions made online access available and then rolled it up and said, the pandemic's over, we don't need to do that anymore. But I think enabling people who have lots of different barriers, who experience barriers both innate and extrinsic, to engage in everything, shopping and meeting and discussing and worship or whatever else they want to, is really democratic, is really good. However, it cannot be a substitute for accessibility and for the sort of in-person welcome. Because we know that there are many things which you cannot do online. You can't hug people online, somebody said to us. You know, that seems banal, but it's very important. You can't have physical contact. You can't gather with people. And the ideas you have, maybe your ideas, and they may be tested out online with other people, but being the thorough debate that you have through a seminar, or in fact, a dinner for that matter, is really, really important, and that may not be possible. So we need to have both. And hopefully, post-pandemic, we will have both, and we'll be more ready for the next pandemic.
Joe. And please feel free to keep your hand up. I'll add it to the list. Joe, go ahead.
Thanks very much. So, Tom, some uncountable number of years ago, I was getting instruction from you about the social model of disability. And you were explaining how we change the world and disability disappears. And I remember saying, and I've repeated this to many students since, so I said to you, but if you're blind, there's something you can't do. And how can we change that through social conditions? And your reply to me was to say, can you run a mile in 4 minutes? I said, well, I can't run a mile at all, so never mind, never mind 4 minutes. And you said, so for all of us, there are some things we can't do. So it's a matter of degree, maybe even commonality. It sounds like you don't believe that anymore. So does current Tom disagree with 20 years ago Tom?
Well, current Tom obviously has had the benefit of your wisdom, so I'm sure he does. No, I do think that not everybody can do everything. I don't think that for example, those list of goods are everybody's, and they are scalar. And disabled people may not be able to see, but they can do lots of things, and that's fine. I think, however, that I want to retain a sense of disability as involving a harm condition, if you like, a difficulty, which you can overcome. You can live a very good life, and lots of non-disabled people live a really miserable life. Let's point that out. So I don't think that you can assume that disabled people won't live a good life, but I do think that we need to pay attention to the inextricable the loss involved in disability. And it may be I'm not sure whether it's a absolute difference or a scalar case. It may be that everybody, the 5-minute mile or whatever, everybody can't do everything, but disabled people, there must be a threshold whereby not being able to do things becomes a real pain in the butt, to put it loosely, because everybody else can, and you're expected to. So I want to retain a sense of that harm condition.
James.
I'm James. I'm from the philosophy department at UCL. So it's a question for Sadie, and that one thing that struck me in thinking about the way you wanted to make use of the circumstances of justice is that, in many ways, things are better than they've been for many people over all of human history. Think about sort of life expectancy and so on. And I guess I was reflecting on, well, how bad would it have actually been had sort of what would have been morally unconscionable happened and the government persisted with the herd immunity strategy? I mean, the worst case scenario looked like maybe 500,000 people would die. Obviously, that would be an extremely bad thing to do, and everybody's glad that didn't happen. But that I think that would have been fully compatible with maintaining the circumstances of justice. There have been many times during human history where societies have been struck by sort of massive sort of blights, pandemics, famines, often which have killed larger numbers of people than that. So I just wasn't sure that, as it were, that the circumstances of justice were the right kind of framing. It seemed that we were sort of within a kind of emergency that's needs to be handled by a civilized society, and we were close to the edge of what was manageable for us, but it seemed to be nowhere near going outside of the circumstances of justice, or at least that was how it seemed to me at the time.
Thank you. So I sort of noted that, that the risk was kind of a lot greater. So not that we actually sort of, tipped in. So so I need to kind of clarify what I mean by that, by like a sort of increase in risk. But one thing to say there is, maybe with COVID that wasn't the case, and we kind of maybe know now that, maybe, but in the early phases, I think there was quite a lot of uncertainty. So I remember being in the US, and I was studying at the time, and I'm trained as a doctor. And I remember talking to some friends, and they were like, "Well, lots of your colleagues might die." This is like very early days. Lots of your colleagues in hospital might die. These things might happen. Like, just seriously thinking about whether I should come back and whether I should interrupt my studies. So I think that what I want to focus on is the early emergency phase, where we didn't really know, like lots of the kind of potential for the risk of like lots of people dying was like much greater than maybe like what later came to be the case with COVID, in part because of the restrictions, but not only because of that. So I think but I do think I need to think more about, like, I haven't, for that reason, I didn't really go into like, reflecting more on the COVID case at the end. So it might be that I need to think more about the risk and when the risk sort of, what happens when there's a sort of sudden kind of quite increase in risk, but the risk still is kind of, maybe not that high. Yeah, to clarify. Thank you.
Nia.
Thank you. I'm Nirayal from Rutgers University. Many years ago, I did my DPhil in the department when it was in a different street. Sadie, I'm gonna, in a way, underwrite Paul's point in urging you to focus on extreme poverty, which you actually said is not your message when you were arguing against the other wolf, the wolf with one F, on climate change, both because of Paul's good point and for two other reasons. One is this would be exactly John Rawls's position. So I think that when he discusses the priority of liberty, he says it's just it's non-applicable when the badness is the badness of extreme scarcity, not so much Quay being inapplicable for justice, but just because it's bad, very bad. Secondly, I thought your own talk showed that justice does apply and has things to say in circumstances of extreme scarcity, and yet you want to say the threshold is when it's when it's no longer extreme scarcity. So for all these reasons, it's consistent with your philosophy and consistent with Rawls's philosophy to take the position that Paul is urging you to take.
Yeah, sorry, would you mind repeating because maybe I misunderstood because I focused on kind of the circumstances, but yeah, I just kind of repeating how you.
So I thought that one of your excellent points was that justice does have things to say even when there is extreme scarcity.
So was that the kind of case?
So the circumstance of justice for you, unlike for Rawls, extend to circumstances of extreme scarcity. If you think, however, that the prevention of that thing, which can no longer be called the non-circumstance of justice, it can be called extreme scarcity, justifies restrictions of liberty, then your position is that the restrictions of on liberty are justified when the chance of otherwise landing in extreme scarcity is too high.
So when you say, kind of, I pointed to that, was that with the shipwreck case, or I'm not sure I sort of was
So
yeah.
I thought you cogently pointed out when, say, for example, the ship. Yes, that would be one case of several you mentioned.
Yeah. So the shipwreck case, I guess I was what I was trying to do then was to argue against it in a way. So sort of to say that it sort of looks like it applies. We kind of think, but then maybe what if two people or three people are required to kind of jump off the? So I take justice to be sort of. If two or three people are required to jump off because they have a lottery and then that's what they decide that sort of the rest are going to stay. I think I would want to say that these people are kind of moral saints, so they're kind of engaging in an act of super. I don't think they're kind of required by justice to do that. So I guess that was my point. There was that we might think, so with the example of Scott's Captain notes as well, that it's we might think. I feel like it would be wrong to say, oh, they're just doing what they're required to do by justice. I think is actually kind of they're going beyond that, beyond what they're required to do. So that was the point.
Say central allocator convert their body over people who a greater number of other people, whatever, that would be unjust, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Nir.
Ingrid.
Thanks. I have a question for Tom. I wonder to what extent conceptualizations or understandings of disabilities can hold for all disabled people. And I have some knowledge both in practice but also in my writing on autism. And when I read in disability studies and disability ethics, I think, for example, of the book of Elizabeth Barnes, which is on. She writes this whole book that's saying that disability is a form of social oppression, and then she has one footnote. She says, "I'm going to write on physical disabilities," and one footnote saying, "But I actually believe all of this also holds for psychiatric disabilities and sensory disabilities." I have some doubts, but I'm not a specialist in the sense that I'm not a disability. So I just wondered to what extent the analysis that you presented, but also your general thinking, actually is that we should diversify more within different types of disabilities.
I have lots of things to say about balance, but I think one of the things I would say is by excluding, as it were, more difficult cases, she's making her life a lot easier. And she acknowledges that. She says, I can't do it all, then I'll do this, and that's fine. But I don't think it's fun. I think we need a theory of disability which deals with or has space for people with autism, people with intellectual disability, people with dementia, people with mental health conditions. So I think that in those cases, it applies to all these different instances to some extent or other, that there is a social factor. Of course there is. And also, I think there is an intrinsic factor. There is a biological factor. So, for example, a guy with autism is saying that he was triggered by birdsong. So it's nothing, I don't think birdsong is social. It's the natural world. So even, to live in that world, live in this world, would be difficult for that person. And therefore, I think that what I said previously, which was that we need to attend to both the constraints of biology, if you like, and also the constraints of social oppression and social exclusion, are relevant for all of them. I think probably in different degrees, definitely, and in different ways, definitely. And the ways in which people are excluded are different. For example, during the pandemic, people with intellectual disability may have relied on the state through funding of voluntary organisations for their entire social life. And they may have not had the resources. They didn't publish papers. They didn't bring their mates and have philosophical discussions. So they're more isolated, I think. So I would like to be nuanced about the different forms of impairment. But I think I had a disagreement, in fact, with somebody with visual impairment. And he said, well, my brain is free of all of the cognitive load of vision. Vision is quite costly. And he doesn't have that. And therefore, he can do quadratic equations in that part of his brain. I don't know whether that's true. I want to speak to a neuroscientist. There's certainly, the brain is very plastic. We use the brain in lots of different ways. But I had no answer to him, so that's why I want to know if it's true. But I think generally it's true that almost all impairments involve a biological limitation, which is not necessarily mean that you don't have a good life, but you can't do things which you would averagely expect to be able to do, and that may cause you distress and suffering. And I don't include running a 4-minute mile or whatever in that. But also, the obvious social disadvantages. So I think that is really interesting, and I wish more philosophers would spend time on it.
So I'm afraid it's the first name I don't know. The person in the dark suit at the back of that room.
Jesse Hamilton, based here at the University of Oxford. So my question is for Sadie. Thank you for the talk. So I want to raise a potential problem, and here's how I'll frame it. So it seems like there are going to be two questions where scientists or other experts are going to need to be needed. So the first question is, what are the consequences and what is the proper policy response? The second question is, given the answer to the first question, are we at risk of falling out of the circumstances, the Rawlsian circumstances of justice? And so in an emergency, there's going to be a limited set of scientific facts produced by a limited set of experts. And so do you worry that the same facts that determine whether we're about to fall out of the circumstances of justice are also going to be used to determine the proper policy response? That seems it seems like a risk.
We'll hold off on the answer. The person by the pillar in front of Pascal.
Valerie, I'm a DPhil at the Blavatnik. I had two small comments, one for Sadie, one for Tom. Sadie, you might want to go back to when Sandel wrote about liberalism and the limits of justice, his argument against Locke was, look, the circumstances of justice, it's not about whether you have abundance or scarcity. If you have ethical agreement, you're not going to need justice. So that's a different argument that he made. And you might want to think about where that fits in to your argument. So rather than scaling between scarcity and abundance, think about, is there something we're missing out when we only make it about justice? And then for Tom, it's interesting because I think Rawls was deeply caring about discrimination. He wouldn't have come up with a veil of ignorance if he didn't care about discrimination. I think that your argument that is valid against him, that Sen made, is he asked the wrong question, which is not how do you distribute these goods, but how do you secure functionings? And that was the argument that Joe then took up in Disadvantage. So it's a different way of making it. It gets to the same criticism, but it's a different way of getting there.
Thank you. Brief 1 minute replies from each of you, please. Sadie.
I think I actually need to ask more clarification on what you actually, because I didn't fully understand, so maybe I can do that.
Maybe a coffee question.
Yeah, thank you.
Tom. Yeah. Do you want to respond, Tom?
No, I want to think.
Perfect. It's exactly 2 o'clock. I've been asked to make sure you're back at 2:15. Please join me in thanking the panelists.